she texted, hanging with the girls tonight. Location showed a hotel. I replied, have fun, sold everything and left movers a note. Her 4M where's everything, call? Straight to voicemail. I thought I knew my wife better than anyone after 4 years of marriage, but apparently Bethany had been perfecting the art of deception while I perfected spreadsheets and client portfolios. I'd always prided myself on being observant in my financial consulting work, catching discrepancies that others missed, but somehow I'd been blind to the inconsistencies happening right under my own roof. The text came through at 6:47 p.m. on a Tuesday while I was reviewing quarterly reports for a client, a casual message that should have been routine after 2 months of increasingly frequent girls' nights with her accounting firm colleagues. I glanced at my phone expecting the usual wine bar selfie or group photo from whatever trendy downtown spot they'd chosen that week, but instead found something that made my analytical mind immediately shift into investigation mode. The photo showed Bethany laughing with what appeared to be her coworkers at a dimly lit table, the kind of casual snapshot she always sent to keep me informed of her whereabouts, except this time she'd accidentally shared the location metadata along with the image. According to my phone's mapping system, the photo had been taken at the Grandview Hotel downtown, not Russo's wine bar where she'd claimed they were meeting for their regular Tuesday night gathering. I stared at the screen for several minutes, cross-referencing the timestamp with her text message and feeling that familiar knot of suspicion that had been growing in my stomach over the past several weeks. The Grandview wasn't just any hotel, it was the upscale business district property where traveling executives stayed when they wanted to impress clients or conduct discreet meetings away from their home offices. I knew the place well from my consulting work, having met numerous out-of-town clients in their lobby restaurant over the years, and it definitely wasn't the kind of venue where accounting firm employees grabbed casual drinks after work. I found myself analyzing the photo with the same methodical approach I used for financial audits, noting details that seemed off about the setting and the people visible in the background. The lighting was wrong for a wine bar, the furniture looked like hotel seating, and I could make out what appeared to be a hotel key card on the table near Bethany's elbow, partially obscured by her purse but still visible to someone trained to spot anomalies in data. Instead of immediately calling her out on the discrepancy, I took a screenshot of both the message and the location data, filing it away in my memory while crafting a response that wouldn't reveal my discovery. I typed back a simple, "Have fun, love you," and set my phone aside, but my mind was already working through the implications of what I'd just uncovered. This wasn't the first time in recent weeks that Bethany's stories about her whereabouts had contained small inconsistencies, details that didn't quite add up when I thought about them later, but I dismissed them as simple miscommunications or my own paranoia. Now I realized I'd been unconsciously collecting a pattern of discrepancies that painted a picture I didn't want to acknowledge, even as my professional instincts screamed that something was fundamentally wrong with the data I was receiving about my own marriage. Over the following hours, I found myself replaying conversations from the past 2 months, remembering how Bethany had become increasingly vague about who exactly would be joining these Tuesday gatherings, claiming it was usually just Sarah from accounts receivable and maybe Jessica from payroll, but never providing the kind of specific details she used to share about her social activities. I recalled how she'd started getting ready for these evenings with more care than usual, spending extra time on her makeup and choosing outfits that seemed more appropriate for impressing someone than grabbing casual drinks with female coworkers. The pieces were falling into place with the same methodical precision I brought to financial analysis, each small inconsistency building toward a conclusion I didn't want to reach but couldn't ignore. I spent the rest of that evening researching ways to discreetly verify location data from photos, learning about metadata and GPS coordinates while Bethany presumably continued whatever she was actually doing at the Grandview Hotel. By the time she returned home at 11:30 p.m., slightly disheveled with a story about Jessica having too much wine and needing a ride home, I had already begun formulating a plan that would either confirm my suspicions or prove them unfounded, though deep in my gut I already knew which outcome was more likely. Instead of confronting Bethany the next morning with accusations and demands for explanations, I chose a different path that reflected everything I'd learned about strategic planning in my years of financial consulting. I understood that emotional reactions often led to poor decision-making, and if my suspicions were correct, I needed to protect myself legally and financially before whatever storm was coming hit our marriage. The first call I made was to David Richardson, a divorce attorney whose services I'd recommended to clients facing similar situations, scheduling a consultation for Thursday afternoon under the pretense of helping a friend navigate a difficult separation. During our meeting, I presented the situation hypothetically while taking careful notes about asset protection, documentation requirements, and the legal advantages of maintaining the moral high ground in divorce proceedings. David explained how infidelity cases typically unfolded in our state, emphasizing the importance of evidence and the financial benefits of being the wronged party rather than the one who initiated conflict through accusations or confrontational behavior. I left his office with a clear understanding of what I needed to do to protect myself and a retainer agreement tucked safely in my briefcase, though I told myself I was simply being cautious rather than planning for the inevitable. Over the following week, I began implementing a careful strategy designed to safeguard my interests while gathering the information I needed to make informed decisions about my future. I opened a separate checking account at a different bank, transferring funds that represented my individual contributions to our joint savings and removing my name from non-essential shared accounts that Bethany could drain if things went bad quickly. I started photographing important documents, our household inventory and financial statements, creating a comprehensive record of our shared assets that would be crucial if we ended up dividing property through legal proceedings. The most challenging part was maintaining normal behavior while conducting this investigation, continuing to kiss her goodbye each morning and ask about her day each evening while internally cataloging every inconsistency in her responses. I found myself paying closer attention to her phone habits, noting how she'd started taking it into the bathroom during showers and keeping it face down during dinner, small changes that individually meant nothing but collectively suggested someone with something to hide. I also began researching our cell phone records through our shared account, discovering a pattern of late-night calls to a number I didn't recognize, always on the nights following her supposed girls' nights out. The calls typically lasted 15 to 20 minutes and occurred around midnight, well after she'd returned home and claimed to be exhausted from her evening with coworkers. When I reverse-searched the number, I discovered it belonged to Marcus Chin, a name that appeared frequently in Bethany's work conversations as a client representative from Morrison & Associates, a rival accounting firm that had been pursuing several contracts with her company. I remembered Bethany mentioning Marcus in passing over recent months, usually in the context of challenging negotiations or client entertainment events. But suddenly those casual references took on a different significance when viewed through the lens of my growing suspicions. I spent hours researching Marcus online, finding his LinkedIn profile, company bio, and social media presence, building a comprehensive picture of the man who seemed to be occupying an increasing amount of my wife's attention. He was 35, divorced, drove a BMW according to his Instagram posts, and frequently shared photos from upscale restaurants and hotels around the city, including several recent shots from the Grandview Hotel's rooftop bar. The pieces were falling into place with mathematical precision, each new discovery confirming what my analytical mind had already concluded based on the available data. The following Tuesday evening, Bethany announced another girls' night out with her usual casual tone, claiming she was meeting Sarah and Jessica at a new wine bar downtown to celebrate someone's birthday promotion. I watched her get ready with the same extra care I'd noticed before, choosing a dress that seemed more appropriate for a romantic dinner than drinks with female colleagues, and felt that familiar combination of sadness and determination settle in my chest as I realized this would likely be our last evening together as husband and wife. I had spent the previous 3 days finalizing arrangements with Premium Moving Solutions, a company that specialized in discreet relocations for executives and professionals who needed to move quickly and efficiently without drawing attention from neighbors or family members. The movers were scheduled to arrive at 8 p.m., giving Bethany enough time to leave for her supposed evening out while ensuring I'd have several hours to supervise the removal of my belongings before she returned home. I kissed her goodbye at the door, told her to have fun with her friends, and watched her drive away in her silver Honda Accord, knowing that she was almost certainly heading to meet Marcus rather than any co-workers from her accounting firm. The moment her taillights disappeared around the corner, I called the moving company to confirm they were on schedule and began systematically packing my most important documents, photographs, and personal items into boxes I'd prepared over the weekend. When the movers arrived precisely at 8 p.m., I was ready with a detailed inventory list and specific instructions about which items belonged to me versus what should remain in the apartment for Bethany. We worked efficiently through the evening, loading my furniture, electronics, clothing, and personal belongings into their truck while I maintained constant awareness of the time and Bethany's usual schedule for these supposed girls' nights. The team was professional and discreet, understanding that this was a sensitive situation requiring careful handling and complete confidentiality, and they had everything packed and loaded by 10:30 p.m., well before Bethany's typical return time of around midnight. After the movers left, I stood alone in our apartment that now contained only Bethany's possessions, furniture that belonged to her before our marriage, and the kitchen items we'd bought together that I'd decided to leave behind as part of my clean break strategy. The space looked strangely hollow and impersonal without my contributions, like a stage set that had been partially dismantled after the final performance of a long-running show. I placed the letter I'd spent hours writing on the kitchen counter where Bethany would be certain to find it when she returned, weighing it down with her favorite coffee mug to ensure it wouldn't be missed or accidentally discarded. The letter was 3 pages long, written in my careful handwriting rather than typed, explaining exactly what I'd discovered about her deception, how I'd felt during the investigation process, and my decision to end our marriage without the drama of confrontations or attempts at reconciliation. I detailed the evidence I'd gathered, including the location metadata from her photos, the phone records showing her calls to Marcus, and my research into their connection through her work, presenting the facts in the same methodical way I'd present financial analysis to a client. I explained that I didn't want to hear explanations or justifications, that I'd already made my decision based on the available evidence, and that all future communication should go through my attorney whose contact information was included at the bottom of the letter. Before leaving the apartment for the final time, I walked through each room one last time, checking to make sure I hadn't forgotten anything important while mentally cataloging the memories associated with each space that I'd soon need to let go of completely. I locked the door, left my key on the kitchen counter next to the letter, and drove to the furnished corporate apartment I'd rented across town, where I would start the next chapter of my life as a single man who'd learned valuable lessons about trust and self-respect through one of the most difficult experiences of his adult life. I was settled in my new temporary apartment, reviewing documents and finalizing divorce paperwork when my phone began buzzing with blocked calls at 4:17 a.m., exactly the time I'd calculated Bethany would return from whatever she'd actually been doing under the guise of celebrating with coworkers. I had anticipated this moment for days, knowing that her discovery of the empty apartment and my letter would trigger immediate panic and desperate attempts to reach me, which was exactly why I'd made the decision to block her number before executing my departure plan. The automated system I'd set up sent her calls directly to voicemail without even ringing on my end, allowing me to sleep peacefully while she presumably stood in our former shared living space confronting the reality of what her deception had cost her. When I checked my phone the next morning, I found 17 missed calls and a series of increasingly frantic voicemails that chronicled her emotional journey from confusion to panic to desperate pleading, each message revealing more about her true character than 4 years of marriage had shown me. The first few voicemails were almost casual, asking where I was and whether I'd gone to visit my brother unexpectedly, followed by confusion about why all my furniture and belongings had disappeared while she was out for the evening. By the 5th message, recorded around 4:45 a.m., she'd clearly found and read my letter because her tone shifted to shock and disbelief, claiming there had to be some misunderstanding and demanding that I call her immediately to discuss what she insisted was a completely innocent friendship with Marcus. The middle messages, recorded between 5 a.m. and 6 a.m., revealed her growing desperation as she realized I'd been planning this departure for weeks while she continued her deception, and her voice became increasingly shrill as she alternated between anger at my secretiveness and panic about losing the comfortable lifestyle I'd provided. She accused me of being controlling and manipulative for investigating her activities, claimed that her meetings with Marcus were purely professional networking opportunities that I'd misinterpreted due to jealousy and insecurity, and demanded that I return home immediately to work through what she characterized as a simple miscommunication between married partners. The final messages, recorded around 7 a.m. after she'd presumably had time to fully process the implications of my letter and the evidence I'd presented, showed a woman who'd finally realized the magnitude of what she'd lost through her dishonesty. She alternated between sobbing apologies and desperate promises to end all contact with Marcus, swearing that their relationship had never been romantic and that she'd been stupid to risk our marriage for what she now claimed was meaningless attention from a client. I listened to each voicemail with the same analytical detachment I brought to reviewing financial statements, noting how her story changed as she became more desperate and how she consistently avoided taking full responsibility for her choices while trying to manipulate me through emotional appeals. The most revealing aspect of her messages was how quickly she shifted from denying any wrongdoing to minimizing the significance of her relationship with Marcus, suggesting that she'd been prepared with a series of backup explanations depending on how much I'd actually discovered about her activities. Between the desperate phone calls, she'd also reached out to my brother Tom, my closest friend Jake from college, and even my parents, hoping to enlist them as intermediaries who might convince me to reconsider my decision or at least agree to meet with her for one final conversation. Tom later told me that Bethany had called him at 6 a.m., crying hysterically and claiming that I'd suffered some kind of mental breakdown that caused me to abandon our marriage over innocent work relationships, painting herself as the confused victim of my sudden and irrational behavior. However, my strategic decision to inform my inner circle about the situation days before executing my departure plan meant that her attempts to control the narrative failed completely, since everyone she contacted already knew the truth about her deception and my methodical investigation process. While Bethany spent the following weeks alternating between desperate attempts to reach me and increasingly erratic behavior that concerned her remaining friends, I continued my methodical investigation into her relationship with Marcus, discovering details that transformed my personal betrayal into something much more serious with professional and legal implications. During my original research into Marcus Chen's background, I'd noted that Morrison & Associates was actively pursuing several high-value contracts with Bethany's firm, Hartwell & Company, but I hadn't initially understood the full significance of this business relationship until I began examining the timeline more carefully. I spent hours cross-referencing Bethany's text messages, which I'd legally accessed through our shared phone account, with Marcus's social media posts and business development announcements from Morrison & Associates, discovering a pattern that suggested Bethany had been sharing confidential client information and internal strategic plans with Marcus in exchange for expensive gifts and romantic attention. The evidence was particularly damning when I compared the dates of Bethany's supposed girls' nights with Morrison's successful contract bids, finding an almost perfect correlation between her meetings with Marcus and her company subsequently losing major accounts to his firm. I discovered receipts for jewelry, expensive dinners, and designer handbags that Marcus had purchased for Bethany, items that far exceeded what someone would typically spend on casual dating, suggesting a more transactional relationship based on the value of the information she was providing. My analysis revealed that over the past 6 months, Hartwell & Company had lost over $2 million in contracts to Morrison & Associates, losses that could be directly attributed to Morrison's suspiciously accurate counterproposals that seemed to anticipate every move Hartwell planned to make during negotiations. Armed with this evidence, I made the difficult decision to compile a comprehensive report documenting Bethany's apparent breach of fiduciary duty and professional ethics violations, understanding that exposing her misconduct would likely end her career in accounting while protecting other companies from similar betrayals. I submitted an anonymous tip to Hartwell & Company's internal compliance department, including detailed documentation of Bethany's communications with Marcus, evidence of the gifts she'd received, and analysis showing the correlation between her meetings with him and the firm's contract losses to Morrison & Associates. The investigation moved quickly once Hartwell's legal department recognized the severity of the potential ethics violations and the financial impact on their business, and within 2 weeks Bethany was suspended pending a full internal audit of her client files and communication records. The suspension became termination within another week when the investigation confirmed that Bethany had indeed shared confidential client strategies, budget information, and competitive intelligence with Marcus, violations that not only cost her job but also triggered a referral to the state accounting board for disciplinary action. Simultaneously, I learned through my professional network that Morrison and Associates was facing its own internal investigation after several companies complained about suspiciously well-informed competitive bids, leading to Marcus's termination and potential legal action for industrial espionage. The irony wasn't lost on me that Bethany's attempt to secure her future through deception had instead destroyed both her career prospects and her relationship with the man she'd betrayed me for, leaving her with nothing to show for her choices except professional disgrace and a tarnished reputation that would follow her throughout the tight-knit accounting community. During this period, I continued to ignore Bethany's increasingly desperate attempts to contact me, though I did monitor her social media presence to ensure she wasn't spreading false information about me or attempting to damage my professional reputation in retaliation for the consequences she was facing. Her Instagram posts devolved from carefully curated lifestyle content to cryptic messages about betrayal and unfair treatment, followed by lengthy rants about jealous ex-husbands and vindictive men who couldn't handle strong independent women, content that only served to further damage her credibility among mutual friends who knew the truth about our situation. The most satisfying aspect of watching Bethany's professional downfall was seeing how quickly Marcus distanced himself from her once the investigations began, abandoning her completely when she became a liability rather than an asset, proving that his interest had always been transactional rather than romantic. 2 weeks after Bethany's termination from Hartwell & Company became public knowledge within our professional and social circles, I decided it was time to address the inevitable questions and speculation about our sudden separation by sharing the truth with our mutual friends during our monthly gathering at the Corner Tap, a sports bar that had served as our group's unofficial headquarters for the past 3 years. I knew that Bethany had been reaching out to various friends with her version of events, painting me as a controlling husband who'd abandoned her during a difficult time at work, and I wanted to ensure that people who mattered to both of us understood the real sequence of events before her narrative became accepted as fact. I arrived at the Corner Tap early, securing our usual high-top table near the back corner where we could talk without interruption, and spent the time organizing my thoughts and preparing copies of key evidence that I could share if necessary to support my account of what had happened. When my friends began arriving for our regular Thursday night gathering, I could tell from their expressions that they'd already heard conflicting versions of recent events and were hoping tonight would provide some clarity about why Bethany and I had suddenly ended our marriage without any warning signs that our relationship was in trouble. The group consisted of 6 people who'd known us as a couple for years: my college roommate Jake and his wife Monica, our neighbors Chris and Jennifer from the apartment complex, and 2 co-workers from my consulting firm, Brian and Lisa, who'd socialized with us regularly and had always seemed to enjoy Bethany's company. I waited until everyone had ordered their drinks and settled into conversation before addressing the elephant in the room, explaining that I wanted to share my perspective on recent events rather than let rumors and speculation continue to circulate among people who cared about both Bethany and me. I began by acknowledging that our separation had been sudden and probably seemed inexplicable from the outside, but that I'd discovered evidence of deception and professional misconduct that made continuing our marriage impossible, presenting the facts in the same calm, methodical way I would present any business analysis to colleagues. I showed them screenshots of the location metadata from Bethany's photos that contradicted her stories about girls' nights out, phone records documenting her regular communication with Marcus Chen, and evidence of the expensive gifts he'd purchased for her during the same period when she was sharing confidential client information that cost her company millions of dollars in lost contracts. The reaction around the table was immediate and unanimous: shock at the scope of Bethany's deception, followed by understanding about why I'd chosen to end the relationship so decisively rather than attempt counseling or reconciliation. Jake was particularly vocal about his support for my decision, noting that he'd always found Bethany's constant social media posts about expensive restaurants and luxury purchases suspicious given her stated salary, and that my evidence finally explained how she'd been funding a lifestyle that seemed beyond her means. Monica expressed disappointment that Bethany had manipulated their friendship by asking for advice about work problems that were actually ethical violations, while Chris and Jennifer admitted they'd always been puzzled by Bethany's Tuesday night absences and her vague explanations about where she was going and who she was meeting. The most validating responses came from Brian and Lisa, who worked in the same professional environment and immediately understood the severity of Bethany's ethics violations and the career damage she'd inflicted on herself through her choices, with Lisa noting that such misconduct would make Bethany essentially unemployable in their industry for the foreseeable future. By the end of the evening, everyone at the table had expressed support for my decision to leave the marriage and admiration for the methodical way I'd protected myself legally and financially while gathering evidence of her betrayal, with several people noting that my approach had been far more mature and strategic than the dramatic confrontations they might have chosen in similar circumstances. 8 months after I'd walked out of that empty apartment for the final time, I found myself standing in the living room of my new townhouse in the Arts District, looking out at tree-lined streets that represented everything I'd been working toward since the day I decided to rebuild my life from scratch. The divorce settlement had been finalized 3 weeks earlier, heavily favoring me due to Bethany's professional misconduct and breach of fiduciary duty, which meant I'd retain the majority of our shared assets while avoiding any responsibility for the legal debts she'd accumulated during her ethics investigation. My independent financial consulting practice was thriving beyond my most optimistic projections, with several major clients who'd followed me from my previous firm and new business coming in through referrals from satisfied customers who appreciated my thorough, methodical approach to financial analysis and strategic planning. The townhouse itself was everything I'd wanted but never thought I could afford while supporting Bethany's expensive lifestyle habits: hardwood floors, exposed brick walls, a modern kitchen with granite countertops, and a home office where I could meet with clients in a professional setting that reflected my growing success. I was reviewing quarterly reports for my largest client when I heard the familiar notification sound from my phone, indicating a new message on the business networking app one used to connect with potential clients and industry colleagues, though I almost ignored it since I'd been getting increasingly frequent connection requests from people who wanted to discuss Bethany's ethics scandal rather than actual business opportunities. The message was from someone named Sarah Mitchell, a financial analyst at a mid-sized investment firm who was looking for a consultant to help with a complex portfolio restructuring project, exactly the kind of high-value engagement that had been keeping my business calendar booked solid for months. I responded with my standard professional inquiry about project scope and timeline, expecting the usual back-and-forth negotiations about deliverables and fees, but Sarah's reply surprised me with its directness and genuine enthusiasm about working with someone who had a reputation for ethical business practices and thorough analytical work. We arranged to meet at a coffee shop near her office the following Tuesday, the same day of the week when Bethany used to announce her fictional girls' nights out, though the irony didn't escape me that I was now using those evenings to build genuine professional relationships rather than being deceived about my wife's whereabouts. Sarah turned out to be exactly the kind of client I'd hoped to attract with my independent practice: intelligent, focused, and genuinely interested in long-term financial strategy rather than quick fixes or shortcuts that might compromise ethical standards. During our initial consultation, she mentioned that she'd heard about my work through a mutual colleague who'd specifically recommended me as someone who could be trusted with sensitive financial information and complex analytical challenges, praise that felt particularly meaningful given everything I'd been through with Bethany's professional betrayals. The project itself was fascinating and challenging, requiring me to analyze investment patterns across multiple market sectors while developing recommendations for portfolio optimization that would maximize returns while minimizing risk exposure, exactly the kind of work that had drawn me to financial consulting in the first place. As we worked together over the following weeks, I found myself appreciating Sarah's direct communication style and her obvious commitment to maintaining the highest professional standards, qualities that reminded me how much I'd missed having genuine professional relationships built on mutual respect rather than hidden agendas. It was during our third project meeting, while we were discussing long-term investment strategies over lunch at a restaurant I'd chosen specifically because it wasn't one of the expensive places where Marcus used to take Bethany, that I realized I was enjoying myself in a way I hadn't experienced since the early days of my marriage. The conversation flowed naturally from business topics to personal interests, and I found myself sharing stories about my townhouse renovation and my plans for expanding the consulting practice, while Sarah talked about her passion for hiking and her goal of eventually starting her own investment fund focused on sustainable development projects. When I walked home that evening, I felt genuinely optimistic about my future for the first time since discovering Bethany's deception, recognizing that I'd finally reached a point where my life was defined by my own choices and achievements rather than by the damage someone else had inflicted through their betrayal and dishonesty.